Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. We are very excited at the campaign today to launch our Big Bets Working webinar series. This is a new series that the campaign for grade level reading is launching after as a follow-up to and a continuation of our Learning Loss Recovery Challenge webinar series, which we launched in May 2020. Since then, we've hosted more than 140 webinars in this series using the CGLR Learning Tuesdays platform so that you all are receiving data and information as well as methods to respond to the local, state, and national news around stopping and slowing and reversing learning loss. In 2021, we identified this group of big bet worthy programs and strategies, and this year we're going to spend some time reviewing them. And so as we look at national data around where we're seeing success, where we're seeing equitable learning recovery occurring, we're going to talk about how these big bets are working and lift up and celebrate these approaches, as well as what still needs to happen in these areas so that we can have a future where all of our students, all of our young people, families, and communities have opportunities to grow and learn. So welcome to each and every one of you. Today, our session, Connecting Communities, National and Local Partners, Connecting Families to the Web. I would like to introduce our moderator for today, who is Irene Chen. She is the Director of District Partnerships at Khan Academy and will be working and works to support districts in enhancing student digital learning in schools. And so welcome, Irene, and thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you. It is such a pleasure. And thank you again to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for, again, keeping our attention focused on these kind of really important initiatives for us as a nation and in our local communities. Okay, we have a wonderful panel prepared for you. Let me first introduce the panelists and then we will dive in. Today, we welcome Michael Calabrese. Michael is the director of the Wireless Future Project at New America. Then the New America is focused on developing and advocating for policies that promote universal and affordable connectivity. Next up, we will be welcoming Amina Fazula. Amina is the head of technology policy at Common Sense, and she works on expanding access to technology and digital equity. We are also welcoming Andrew Spector. Andrew is a fellow with the Patterson Foundation and comes to the foundation with deep experience in youth leadership and development. And today we also have Adeyinka Ogunlagan. She is Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy at the Education Superhighway. Adeyinka's work focuses on bringing together champions so that we can close the broadband affordability gap. Okay, so today, we've organized ourselves to kind of present in kind of like three different sections and to have a conversation in three different sections. First, number one, why are we here? Talking about the importance and kind of like the end outcomes we want to achieve with connectivity. Section two, we're going to give it to you straight, talking about how are we doing? What is like the good news to celebrate and what are kind of the challenges that remain ahead of us. And then our third section, we will be talking about the challenges and solutions going forward, as well as kind of actions we can all take. All right. Well, Amina, come on camera. We're going to get it kicked off in terms of why we are here. When COVID hit our nation and the globe, right, hit the globe back in 2020, there was a need for connectivity in our homes in a way we had never experienced before. Can you tell us a little bit about like the national policy that and our funding response to that crisis?
Yeah, so thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be in front of the grade level reading community again. In the early days of the pandemic, I think, one of the questions those of us have been working on digital divide issues impacting families, one thing that we heard very early on was, how do we keep learning going during the pandemic? And for anybody who'd been working on the digital divide prior to the pandemic, we knew that this was a problem. We knew that being able to be nimble and keep learning going in terms of crisis was going to be a heavy lift, in part because of the lack of reliable connectivity within the homes of students all throughout the country. And so at Common Sense in 2019, before the pandemic, we had done a report where we had noticed sort of this upstream distortion that the digital divide was causing on education, meaning that when teachers understood that their students would lack connectivity at home in order to do an assignment or to be able to seek out additional enrichment, they would avoid using technology within the classroom or requiring the use of technology or assignments that might require the use of technology to be able to succeed. And this is in part driven by equity. Teachers understood that it would be unfair for students to have that, for students within their classroom to experience that disparity. And so even though schools were getting connected and teachers were being trained and ed tech was being deployed, it was hard for us to see that use translate all the way through because there's this natural stopping point at home. If the devices turned into bricks when they went home, then teachers would think twice about the usefulness of a device or the usefulness of technology. And that was made blisteringly clear during the pandemic when we were trying to step up remote learning. And we found that, percentages, 10%, 20%, 30% of the school would have limited access to the internet, and it would prevent their ability to effectively use remote learning tools. We did a report where we found about 16 million students are persistently in the digital divide. We also found about 400,000 teachers lacked connectivity at home to be able to effectively continue their administrative duties or to take advantage of technology and resources for school purposes at home. And so this was a huge need. And we were able to, I think, demonstrate to Congress that this was important to fund. And to their credit, they put significant investments behind connectivity. We saw the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which provided support directly to schools to support teachers and students' connectivity needs, as well as devices. We also saw the creation of the Emergency Broadband Benefit, which was broader and allowed support to all vulnerable households throughout the country. Following the Emergency Broadband Benefit was the creation of the Affordable Connectivity Program within the Infrastructure Act. And that helped create sort of a long-term version of the EBB. And so we saw incredible commitments made to affordability, specifically around connectivity at home. So that was really exciting to see.
Yeah, those were important programs. And were you also going to talk about the Digital Equity Act?
That's right. Yeah. And then the Digital Equity Act, which was also part of the Infrastructure Act, was the first program ever created to focus on digital equity needs. So, and this is something, again, for school communities is incredibly salient because it will provide support for training to be able to provide programming around digital literacy for students, for teachers, for parents, for caregivers. There's a whole host of sort of digital equity and digital literacy wraparound programming that schools can now take advantage or to actually supercharge with the Digital Equity Act funds that are coming down the pike.
All right. Thank you for that overview. We wanted to start with kind of the national picture, talking about the funding from like our federal government, and not just the funding for the connectivity, but for digital literacy and the digital equity. All right, Adayinka, I have a question for you. We know that the Education Superhighway identified challenges and barriers to internet access. Tell us about what you've been learning.
Thank you, Irene. Yeah, as you mentioned, Education Superhighway, we've really been focused on broadband adoption. And as Amina mentioned, with the creation of the emergency broadband benefit and the affordable connectivity program, we've really leaned into creating tools and resources to support that ecosystem. But early on, in the sort of the height of the pandemic, we identified 3 key barriers to vulnerable households adopting the internet. Trust awareness was being the first one. Folks were not aware that the ACP or even its predecessor, the emergency broadband benefit, existed, let alone that they qualified for the program. And then the other barrier was trust. When they did hear about the program, if they were hearing about it from an internet service provider, they were a bit skeptical based on maybe a previous bad experience with a provider. I don't want to sign up for service. I'm not sure about this $30 subsidy. Do I qualify for it? Is this like a bait and switch? Also, like, it was really important that they hear from a trusted messenger in their community. So like school districts, teachers, faith-based communities, we found those to be the great messengers who could raise awareness about the program and provide that trusted conduit of information to eligible households. But even overcoming those barriers, enrollment support was and continues to be a barrier for eligible households. Applying for and showing that you qualify for the Affordable Connectivity Program is not easy. The original application, based on the national verifier that's used to enroll households in Lifeline, it could take an eligible household 30 to 45 minutes to complete that online application if they had some form of internet access. And then there was also the paper application route. You send your application off to somewhere that you may never hear back from. So we engaged in a lot of advocacy, not only with the FCC and USAC to streamline that application process, but also to empower trusted partners in communities to provide direct enrollment support where that was needed. And like I said, we've created a whole host of tools to support that ecosystem, from our asynchronous training course called Learn ACP, where folks can get certified on how to enroll someone in the program, and our free resource hub that has all the marketing criteria, collateral, I should say, that communities can use to promote the benefit, raise awareness, drop them into their existing communications channels. And lastly, we also created a pre-enrollment tool to help folks figure out how they qualify. It's one thing to know that the benefit exists and that you qualify for it, but we wanted to make sure folks had a positive experience once they got to the application. So you can enter your zip code, you can enter what qualifying benefits you already receive, be it Medicaid or SNAP, and it will tell you, okay, based on what you've entered, you should have a copy of your Medicaid card when you get to the application. You'll need that to prove that you're eligible. And then also, here are the plans available from service providers based on where you live that are free with the benefit applied. Again, giving those trusted messengers the opportunity to not only raise awareness, but support with enrollment and make sure that eligible households actually got enrolled in the benefit.
Adeyinka, thank you so much for sharing out those helpful tools, which looks like Hillary just dropped into the chat. But that trust, awareness, and enrollment support are themes that we will be returning to. Michael, I'd like to turn to you. Talk to us about just why connectivity matters for our nation and for communities.
Okay, yeah, and thanks for having me here. I suppose now, having heard about these terrific, pandemic relief programs that got so many more millions connected, 22 million by the Affordable Connectivity Program alone, households. I guess I'll be the bearer of bad news, which is that the homework app is, I think I just knocked myself off. The homework app is back after being greatly reduced by the pandemic programs, particularly the Affordable Connectivity Program and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. And that's because, those programs are just about out of money. There's not even a discussion of renewing or extending the Emergency Connectivity Fund for schools. And it's going to be really difficult in the current budget crisis to get Congress to extend the Affordable Connectivity Program, which runs out of money in roughly April, although there's a gigantic coalition trying to do that. So if the homework app comes back to anywhere close to where, Amina described it was, before the pandemic, more than 10 million K-12 students without internet access at home. This really impacts those students and really all students, because as Amina mentioned, the teachers will hold back on using technology in the classroom or perhaps assigning homework on the internet for equity reasons. So this results in learning loss, since schools increasingly are assuming that students have internet access. I know one survey found that 70% of high school teachers were assigning homework that required the internet. And I'm sure many more would, and especially the younger students, if they knew they had it. Even before the pandemic, 1 in 5 teens often could not complete their homework outside of school. And that was 1 in 4 among Blacks and Hispanics. In mid-2022, a survey by Pew Research found that among middle and high school students in households earning less than $30,000, 24% were not able to complete homework assignments outside school. And about 43% in that low-income group often or sometimes had to rely on cell phones or public Wi-Fi to do their homework. Hence, the stories about kids sitting in the parking lot of McDonald's on a cold evening after school, that will continue, although only for the lower income folks. And even ACP, if it's extended, is not a complete solution for students, because currently half the households receiving the $30 monthly subsidy use it for an adult smartphone, which is not the connectivity that students need. And finally, I'd mention that these disconnected students also lose out on other learning online, on enrichment, and on being, and on acquiring more skills and becoming more comfortable online if the only exposure they get is in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I know that people had been raising and advocating to solve the homework gap long before COVID, but certainly I think seeing the photos of kids trying to do homework in the parking lot of these like fast food outlets, kind of like seared into our memories. Andrew, but the need for connectivity extends even beyond students and their needs for homework. So talk to us about why connectivity matters for like communities, families, all more additional stakeholders.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Irene, and thank you for the opportunity to share today. I think if there's one of the biggest takeaways I want to make sure I communicate today is that digital access intersects with really most issues, if not all issues, in this day and age. And that was a big thing that the Patterson Foundation realized back in June of 2020 when we launched our Digital Access for All initiative, was if we're going to be successful at the Suncoast Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which is one of our initiatives, or anything else we were doing, digital access was key. And when we did research of what people and organizations were doing in this sphere around the country, 3 major legs of digital access work emerged to us: devices, connectivity, and skills. And if you don't have all 3 of those, you don't have digital access. And so when we think about how this matters to communities and how this matters to families, it is central, not just for access to anything, but it's also central to thriving. And when I think back to before I was at the Patterson Foundation, I was a classroom teacher, and then I was leading a youth leadership organization. And even before COVID, as an elementary school teacher, I wasn't able to assign assignments to my students to do on the internet at home. And that means they were missing that enrichment experience, as Adiyinka and Michael both just talked about. And then when COVID hit, we had a shift to virtual, and it wasn't just enough to give them devices, which thankfully our school district was able to make happen. It just because you have device doesn't mean you have connectivity, and doesn't mean you have the skills to use it. And so when we think about how this affects communities and how this affects families, families specifically are the key developers of young people and their households. And so if they don't have the skills or have the devices or connectivity at home, they can't support their young people in the way that they could otherwise. And entire communities can be limited from accessing the sort of resources and opportunities they otherwise would be able to access. So
Yeah.
it's key.
Yeah. We hear you. We're saying like strong families, strong community needs like strong connectivity. Okay, now we're moving into our second section where we're going to talk about how are we doing. So this is time to kind of like celebrate progress. Here's the good news. Here's how we've made progress, but as well as also talk about what are the challenges that remain? You know, what's bad news that we need to be aware of? Amina, can we start off with you? Talk to us about progress. Who has access now that didn't have it in 2020?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the big number from ACP is that there are 22.5 million households that are now connected or relying on ACP to be able to afford home connectivity. Who are those types of people? Like the folks who are eligible for the ACP are folks who are largely low income and are what John Horrigan from the Benton Institute has called subscription vulnerable. So these are folks who fall on and off the internet. So what the ACP has been able to do is make sure people have continuous access to service, and that is so critical. When you support affordability, you support continuous access to service, and then that continuous access is something that institutions can rely on. So just as Andrew was talking about earlier, educators, healthcare professionals, governments that are looking to transition benefits to e-government, all of these institutions that families, especially vulnerable families, rely on, are now able to reliably use technology to be able to reach these communities. And this is super critical because in a lot of cases, in some states, there's a constitutional requirement to make sure that you're deploying certain types of services in an equitable manner. So education in particular has to be offered in an equitable manner, and everybody has to have access to it. So this really unleashes rather innovations that have been left on the shelf because schools can't reliably unleash technology and utilize it within their community. So that's really exciting, those 22.5 million households. We don't have a ton of really specific data on, who is in those households. We do know that about 4 million of the households that are eligible through student-focused pathways. They may be eligible in multiple ways. They may be eligible through free and reduced lunch and SNAP. But we do know that at least 4 million of those households do have students within them. The other data point that we do have about the ECF program is that very quickly, we had estimated about 16 million students were in the digital divide. And within the first few tranches of ECF funding, we saw that about 12 million students were estimated to be connected. So that number, that 16 million students that are persistently in the digital divide, that's largely an accurate number. And so that's really useful information, one, that we're effectively reaching them and that there is that need out there. And we developed a program that meets that need. But also now policymakers and everybody that's interested in keeping these kids connected has a sense of what the size and scope of the ongoing issue will be. And that's about 16 million students that are in this persistent digital divide.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think what you're also reminding us is it's a large population. Good news, we reached them. We got them the funding up until now. I think, Michael, you're reminding us that this funding is drying up. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So take that good news kind of backwards looking with a grain of salt. Now we're gonna need to keep up the funding. Michael, talk to us about what school districts and communities are doing to close the homework gap.
Yeah, some of the good news is that there's been really innovative efforts that even go beyond these programs. And so I think, they really fill some very specific gaps. And so we should be encouraging them and finding ways. So the one I've focused a lot on, and which is now an issue in front of the Federal Communications Commission, is that a growing number of districts are connecting low-income and rural students directly to school networks at home. So districts in rural, exurban, and urban areas, typically targeting low-income, neighborhoods, have used funding from the CARES Act and other COVID relief, from tech bonds, grants, and partnerships with their local governments to leverage wireless technology to extend the reach of their school networks to the students at home. So we profiled a dozen of these districts that are using a variety of models. It was something we did with the Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition, and we may get a link in the chat. There were case studies. This was like about 16 months ago, case studies and an economic analysis showing why it was so cost effective over a longer period. In other words, it was more cost effective for the homework app than it was for the pandemic shutdown, which was short lived. And some are pilot or very targeted efforts. Some are at scale, covering entire neighborhoods, and some close the homework gap completely or almost completely. So, two examples I'd give, for example, the gold standard for me, because they were closed the homework gap completely. In fact, this began before the pandemic in Lindsay, California, which is a farm worker community in California's Central Valley. They, like all of these districts, they leverage free access to the public airwaves, which is what Wi-Fi uses. So they use Wi-Fi, or more commonly, they use the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, which is a new kind of open access to the airwaves for the same sort of cellular 4G and 5G service that mobile carriers provide. And then they combine that sometimes with mobile carrier hotspots. So in Lindsay, they actually used a combination of these technologies, Wi-Fi, CBRS, and some other licenses that were given to schools many years ago. Not many districts have this, but they were able to connect, even though they're 90% free and reduced and have a huge ESL population, they connected, every household to the school's network, and they pay the operating costs by going all digital. So they have no more paper, no textbooks, worksheets, everything's digital. Another success story like that is Council Bluffs, Iowa, which has covered they went neighborhood by neighborhood over the past 6 years, and now they've covered the entire school district. And they use Wi-Fi because their town, really supported this and gave them access to the streetlights, and they put Wi-Fi hotspots or Wi-Fi access points on the streetlights at every intersection, and it covers the district completely. In fact, they're covering a neighboring district outside of Council Bluffs now. A similar thing in the east side of San Jose, California. And then Fresno has a huge program where they're connecting 20,000 low-income households using the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, because their municipality would not give them access to the streetlights. So instead, they use what's called schools as towers. They turn their schools they put antennas up on the roof of all of their middle and high schools, which are more than one story. And they beam, internet access out to the surrounding low-income communities. And they're going into an expansive phase 2 of that now, because it's been so successful. So it's good to know that most of these contract with companies that install networks. So it's not like teachers and administrators are up on the roof or figuring out how to do this. So they typically contract with companies to install the networks. Some partner with local wireless internet service providers. And the economic study we did found that they can be, over a period of more than 3 years, they can be more cost effective than buying mobile hotspot subscriptions from mobile carriers like T-Mobile or Verizon. You asked for kind of good news and bad news. The bad news is that, as I said before, the Emergency Connectivity Fund, the CARES Act, and other pandemic funding that supported much of this has largely dried up. So it's likely, as the homework gap comes back, that we won't see a continued flourishing of these efforts. And that's why we are supporting an effort at the FCC to expand the scope of E-rate to make connecting low-income students away from school an eligible expense. And, we can talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah, we will do that. I mean, I think, Michael, I think what you've been sharing is that there are very concrete case studies you can point to, from like Lindsay to Fresno to East San Jose. We can do this, people. Like, we know how to do the connectivity, but that specter of the homework coming back is out there. So tell us later about what we need to do to kind of, combat that. Thank you. We're going to pivot topics for just a moment now. Adeyinka, some of the unconnected households are living in apartment complexes. And how are you working to create access for these populations?
I'll appreciate that question a lot, Irene. As I mentioned, we're focused on broadband adoption, but we know that 20 to 25% of unconnected households, like you said, they live in apartment buildings. And so when you're talking about innovative solutions, especially like the case studies that Michael referenced, we developed a program that we call Apartment Wi-Fi. If I travel, I check into a hotel, I have the expectation that I'll be able to connect my phone, pull out my laptop, hop on the hotel's Wi-Fi network. And in some cases, a lot of folks, if you move into a new apartment building, a market rate apartment building, or luxury apartment building, building owners are now including internet access as one of the amenities that they offer. So we've developed a program focused on affordable housing, and we were successful in getting this included in the Infrastructure Act as a permissible use of funds to deploy Wi-Fi networks in low income and public housing, create that same instant-on connectivity experience for some of our most vulnerable populations. And thankfully, Congress agreed with us and included that. And so the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which provides money to states based on the number of unserved and underserved households that they have, allows states to allocate funding to deploying Wi-Fi networks in public and affordable housing. States are in the process now of finalizing their initial proposals on how they'll spend those funds, identifying the apartment buildings that will qualify. And so we've been educating state broadband offices and working with building owners as well as managed service providers to make them ready for this opportunity that's coming as states will begin to grant that funding. And we've also successfully piloted this approach using some of our own dollars and local partners. We've done some pilots with apartment buildings in Oakland, and we've really found that building owners are, in some cases, really ready to absorb that cost because they know that by providing that service to their residents, they are not only enhancing the value of the building, but also reducing turnover in terms of their resident population. And so we're continuing to see more states adopt this approach focused on deploying and upgrading the infrastructure in apartment buildings. New York has allocated $100 million to what they call their Affordable Housing Connectivity Program, where they will be investing in upgrading the infrastructure in their public and affordable housing community. Massachusetts has launched a similar initiative, and we're seeing more states adopt this apartment-focused or multi-dwelling unit-focused approach, because we know that if we can provide internet where people live, either for free or almost no cost, then you also do a really good opportunity there to really close the digital divide for those households.
Yeah. And thank you. This is something I just learned something new. This is not something I had thought about before, but it's making me want to talk to my local officials when I think about the affordable housing that's being built, in my community. Is it coming with the internet? That is so smart. I absolutely expect that connectivity when I walk into either public buildings or, into a hotel. Andrew, Maria, I wanted to pivot to you because I know that the Patterson Foundation has been doing a scan of philanthropic giving nationally. And so talk to me about what you've been learning about philanthropic funding and the connection there between philanthropic giving and connectivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in June of 2020, when we launched our Digital Access for All initiative, it was again in response to us recognizing that if we wanted to accomplish any of our initiatives, we needed to think critically about digital access in the Suncoast region. And when we start anything, we do a lot of listening to figure out who or what is already doing this work locally, but also around the country, and see if there are some promising practices we can bring to our area. One of the first things that came to us is that a very, very small percentage of philanthropic dollars are actually invested in digital access work. I think the most recent research shows that I think between 2010 and 2019, less than 0.5% of philanthropic dollars were invested in digital access, which to me is pretty shocking because of the way that it intersects so deeply with key issues like education and healthcare that are deeply invested in by funders. But we did find, even with that 0.5% of funding, that there is some really great work going on around the country when it comes to funders, and there's lots of ways that funders can participate in digital access work. So just a few of those. So we've done 2 national philanthropy scans so far. The first one was really just to get a sense of what the field is doing and who's a part of it. But there's a lot of ways that funders can get involved. Some of those ways are funders can be conveners. We can help build coalitions. We can help build capacity and fund devices. We can do digital navigation, which I'm happy to share a little bit more about later. We can do advocacy and policy, innovation and technology. We can help fund connectivity. We can help form strategic partnerships and multi-sector collaborations. We can work towards sustainability. I think the key for funders to recognize is that there is unique ways that funders, nonprofits, communities, government, businesses can all participate in digital access work. And of course, nobody is going to have as much funding as the federal government or governments in general. So we can't live up to what ECP can provide or a bill of that size. But what we can do is the things I'm mentioning. We can bring people together. We can build coalitions. We can bring people to the table. We can provide funding where necessary, and help connect people with the resources that are available through the government.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. We know that we've got funders, often local funders, dialed into this webinar and watching the recording. So no, there's a role for you too. So thank you. Okay, we're pivoting on to the third section. We're going to be talking about challenges and solutions going forward. So Adeyinka, Andrew was just talking about the national scan he did in philanthropic giving, but clearly the government funding is just a significant role. So what do you think has to be addressed to ensure that that funding is well allotted and spent?
Oh, great question. I would say first and foremost, as Michael and Amina have already pointed out, the pandemic funding that was allocated is due to run out, especially the Affordable Connectivity Program that is now helping 22.5 million households stay online. It's projected that that funding will run out in April. And advocates like us have really been engaged, honestly, since last spring to make sure that Congress not only allocates additional funding to sustain the program, but then provides a permanent mechanism for that program to continue to exist. While the pandemic highlighted the digital divide, it was not new and it has not gone away as we have returned to quote unquote normal life. Digital learning is still very much with us, as well as webinars like this. So making sure that connectivity remains affordable and available to households is a critical part of our work going forward, and making sure that the ACP, or the Affordable Connectivity Program, stays around. We are actively engaged with Congress right now and encouraging our partners to contact their members. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, actually sent a letter to Congress just yesterday saying we are in that window where they need to start issuing guidance on how to wind down the program because funding is expected to run out in the spring. So I would say that that's the key challenge going forward, is making sure that that program specifically stays around. In terms of how the additional federal dollars are allocated, as I mentioned, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, that money is going directly to states to make sure that they achieve universal service within their state. Any unserved location, underserved location, or community anchor institution, like a school, like a library, we want to make sure that they are all connected and using the federal dollars that are made available. I would encourage folks to engage with their state broadband offices. They are required to solicit public comment as they're putting these plans together to get approval from the federal government. It's important that we make sure that properties are properly identified as unserved or underserved. We've seen many instances where the what it's called the National Broadband Map that the FCC has put together will say that 123 Main Street is served. And we do some research on our end and we see that 123 Main Street is not actually served by the providers that say that they have service in that area. And that's part of the cost calculation that states are doing in terms of where they figure out how to allocate money. So I would say engage with your state broadband office, make sure that you are aware of the plan that they are putting together. Even check how your household is labeled on the national map. A few of my colleagues went down that rabbit hole and found out some interesting information as well. So Education Superhighway is really invested in that state work. We are, again, doing lots of outreach and education and partnering with state broadband offices, because our goal is to make sure that no home is left offline. That's especially households that live in multi-dwelling units. We know that providers will go after the single family homes and other institutions, but households in multi-dwelling units specifically have been left behind. And we want to make sure that that does not happen with all of this federal resources that are flowing to states.
Adeyinka, thank you for that. We have state broadband offices. Go check out that map. And later on, we'll be talking about myths to bust. And so I think one of the myths you're already busting is that we have issues in rural areas we need to address. Absolutely, yes. But there are issues in multi-unit dwellings too, right? Let's not leave them behind. Michael, it is the year 2024. I have a feeling we've been advocating for strong connectivity for a long time. Why isn't this an easier problem to solve?
Yeah, it's really a tough problem, and a lot of it. I think the number one answer you get in surveys among low-income people, at least, is affordability. And when people, more and more, it's affordability, not access. In fact, somebody mentioned earlier the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Development Program. That that's a lot of money, $45 billion, which is being given out to states this year to make sure that every household has access to high capacity broadband. But just having access isn't adoption, and that requires the other two things: affordability and skills, digital literacy. So we certainly endorse everything that Adeyinka mentioned. But New America is part of a large national coalition with Common Sense and others pushing for an extension of the Affordable Connectivity Program in particular, because with 22.5 million households, that is a huge number at risk. But I think we also need, considering that the Emergency Connectivity Fund is not being renewed, and the role that universal service plays in the ecosystem, I think that we really need to expand E-rate and give schools and libraries the flexibility to combine approaches that are best suited to their needs, to their local situation. And there are two new FCC expansions of E-rate that are promising but need to be taken quite a bit further. The first, and I think links were put up for each of these a bit earlier. The first of these is that in October, the FCC adopted a declaratory order that set the precedent that E-rate could support connections off school property by deciding that school bus Wi-Fi is E-rate eligible. So I'm sure everybody knows about that, where school districts have outfitted buses, particularly for students on long commutes, with Wi-Fi on board so that students could do homework and then park the buses. The best programs park the buses strategically after school hours and over weekends in low-income areas where the schools could congregate, perhaps for some more convenient than the McDonald's. And the second, so that's a really minor program, but it's an important precedent because up until now, the understanding of E-rate had been that no money could be spent on connections to students or faculty off school property. So initially, E-rate was just the connectivity to school, single connectivity. Now fiber, more than 95% of schools, I think, have a fiber connection now. And then E-rate was expanded under Obama to include Wi-Fi so that you didn't have to troop the kids down the hall to the computer lab. There would actually be, ubiquitous internet access throughout the school and even around the school grounds where students might be outside between, sports practice or whatever. And what we're looking for now is a third expansion, a second expansion of E-rate to extend these Wi-Fi connections even further to the students wherever they are, the entire learning journey. So in November, the FCC released a NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking, that would make wireless hotspot lending to students without internet at home eligible for E-rate funding. And this would include libraries as well to low-income patrons, not only students. And comments on this are due to the FCC on January 16th, although you can file, even a simple letter of support, send it to the chairwoman of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, at any point, ideally with the proceeding mentioned so that it gets in the right place. We are filing with the Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition to ensure that this expansion, covers school networks like the ones I described before, that it's not just to buy subscriptions from big mobile carriers, which is actually it's easier, but it's more expensive in the long term. And there's also a problem with signal quality indoors. So many low-income areas, the students don't get a strong enough cellular signal to do remote learning indoors. And that's one reason, that we have to go further. Right now, E-rate is about $1 billion per year below its cap, meaning that there is headroom to fund, and we should. On the other hand, we're also going to need universal service reform. That's kind of beyond the scope of this webinar, but just to be aware that the overall funding for universal service needs to be changed so that there's enough money for all these programs. And then finally, I'd mentioned that it's been said we need more focus on adoption. So, for example, we helped to stand up a coalition with Common Sense and others to which proposed to use spectrum auction revenue. That is, these auctions of the public airwaves that raise tens of billions of dollars from the mobile carriers. We wanted to earmark a portion of that, up to $10 billion, to endow a digital equity foundation that would specifically support digital navigator programs and other adoption efforts, including through schools and libraries. And legislation has been introduced, but that whole auction issue is kind of at a standstill, like the budget itself in Congress. But that said, the universal solutions are always better, things like ACP, in part also because the lack of connection to parents is a problem not likely to be solved by E-rate, because even if we do all the things we're proposing, it'll connect the student's Chromebook to the school network, but that typically won't, encourage, the family or enable the family to be more in touch with the school's portal or with the teachers and so on, which is why some of those districts we profiled allow the parents to use the connection as well, supposedly just to talk to the school, but I think they probably use it somewhat more broadly, although it is filtered, of course, just like the school's network is in school. So anyway, that's some of the solutions that we're advocating.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, I'm hearing you again kind of paint a framework where, yes, it's affordability, accessibility, and also kind of like the skills and the literacy needed to kind of like really close the gap. While we're on the topic of schools, Amina, I think you have a story here about like how schools in Phoenix supported connectivity, and tell us about that, because it'd be great to hear how like schools are staying engaged.
Yeah.
And the role of community partners too.
Yeah. So I think what we've been doing around schools has been in part about lifting up affordability solutions or connectivity solutions, device solutions. It started back during the early days of the pandemic with the rollout of the ACP, the transition from EBB to ACP. We started to engage with schools, and we partnered in Arizona with ASU and their Experience Center with about 150 call center professionals to help sign people up to the ACP and also answer questions around digital inclusion. Following that, we partnered with the city of Phoenix to directly work with schools in the community. And in relationship with that work, we're also working with a whole host of digital navigators. So the digital navigators, call center professionals at the Experience Center, which we've specifically trained to be digital navigators as well, so that they're not just experts in handling the ACP, but also handling some of these other questions that follow up around digital literacy. But then also partnering with libraries in the community who largely have some of the best and the largest teams of digital navigators in the community. So state libraries, local libraries also have digital navigators on site. It also offers folks an in-person as well as via phone option to be able to connect with digital literacy resources and some in-person ACP support. And then through the city of Phoenix, thanks to the FCC outreach grant, we were able to build out a few more navigators as well as build our own team of additional navigators. So with all of these sort of digital navigators, ACP experts, we've been able to go into the community and offer both in-person phone service, and actually by connecting to Education Superhighway's tools, sort of a self-directed online sign-up service for ACP. But what's been really interesting is that as we've gone into the schools directly in Phoenix, it's been an iterative process. We were shocked to learn that a lot of schools still didn't know about the ACP program. So that was a little bit surprising to hear. And maybe that's in part because schools were already using ECF to some extent or other pandemic-related programs. But what we were finding is that as ECF is winding down, that need was rearing back up. So schools were actually very excited once they sort of realized what the ACP was all about. The timing is just heartbreaking right now to hear that the program is on a path to wind down, because schools are just starting to realize that ECF funding is going to run out ostensibly in June, officially, but many other schools have already, they didn't apply for multiple rounds of grants. And so like their pandemic era funding is gone. And so, the ACP is going to be incredibly useful to them. And so this fall, they just heard about the ACP largely. And, we're pushing it out the door. We did multiple events wherever we would be able to come across parents. So lots of different types of tabling. And that was just to get awareness out. When we did that tabling, what we also found was that parents and caregivers were really interested in digital literacy tools. And so what this has done is it has opened the door for this like ongoing conversation with the community to say like, hey, what type of digital equity needs do you have? Is it affordability? Do you need help finding a low cost or free device? Do you need help understanding how to use these devices and these services? Are you concerned about privacy? Like, would you like to know more about AI and what that means for your kids? So like there's just all sorts of questions that are like bubbling around that parents have. And, it was like sort of a breath of fresh air. All of a sudden, parents were like, oh, I'd love to get more information about, cybersecurity or how to keep my kids safe or, what these various games are all about or, like, what's TikTok, so like that's been really exciting to see. And then being able to partner, like either say, okay, here's materials that we've got at Common Sense that you can use. But then also, if you want to get like skill-based training to support a parent's understanding of technology so that they can scaffold their students as they use technology, here's a program at your local library. So being able to connect the dots from the school all the way to the community partners that are doing this digital inclusion work is really important. And I think ACP has sort of spurred that in a way. And my hope is, one, I really hope that we keep ACP going because I think it like having a fund or having funds to offer up families in need is really meaningful. That's an incredible resource that you're offering them, and they stop and they listen. And then that opens the door for that digital equity conversation. So if we've got Digital Equity Act funds that are coming down the pike and like states across the country are coming up with their Digital Equity Act plans right now, there's an opportunity for schools, for LEAs in particular, for local education agencies to consider how they want to apply for Digital Equity Act funds, first at the state level, but then also at the federal level. So there'll be two pots of money that they could potentially participate in. And so this is a really exciting development because, we'll, for the first time ever, have some really interesting funding resources available for schools that won't impact typical education funding budgets, right? Like this isn't coming from Department of Ed. This isn't coming from, you're not pulling away, like your budget for textbooks, to be able to pay for digital equity. Like this is completely separate. This is coming from the Digital Equity Act funding. So, that's really exciting that you don't have to like rob Peter to pay Paul and like you don't have to take on digital equity as an unfunded mandate.
That is the bright spot, like the funding for like the digital equity. Amina, you earlier were talking about digital navigators, and Andrew, I know that digital navigators is something that you have a lot of passion and experience about. They play a critical role in getting people connected. So what is a digital navigator? What do they do? And what have you learned about how we should be supporting them to be even more successful?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate all the conversation about digital navigators. And I think it was Adeyinka who mentioned it early on, like the actual process, whether it's written or online to apply for ACP, it's hard. It's a challenging process. It's not easy. And when first it was the the EBB came out and then it became ACP, there was no curriculum to teach people like how to do it or teach people to teach people how to do it. And so we developed the Digital Navigator curriculum at the Patterson Foundation and launched a Digital Navigator training program where we do train people at nonprofits to support people in applying for whether it's device or broadband support when it comes to connectivity. So it's as simple as that. It's helping people navigate the process to increase their digital access. And it's important because it's hard to do. And it's not just hard to do as like any person, but also it's key to meet people where they're at. And that's why it wasn't enough for us to just have like a team of digital navigators at the Patterson Foundation. It was important that we were building capacity in organizations in our community so that they can do it. Just like a couple quick examples is that we trained 5 volunteers at a multicultural health institute who primarily deal with minority families in a health setting. And they became digital navigators. And now that's incorporated into their healthcare work, helping make clients eligible for telehealth and to be able to research different medical conditions. So that one, to my point previously about the intersections between digital access and other fields like healthcare, but also that's something we couldn't do without building capacity in that particular area. And another quick example is we trained 4 staff at the Easter Seals of Southwest Florida. They work with families with disabilities. And that's another community that was really important to build capacity in them so that they can support with digital access there too. A couple other things just I want to quickly highlight related to that is sort of as like a pre-support to the digital navigators, we also have what we call our ACP engagers. And so these aren't people that are like fully trained in the ability to like actually do the application with people, but they do share information about the federal opportunity. So they're kind of like a screening force. And so we have a team of ACP engagers that we send to different events in the community or events that we put on or that already exist, and just to share about it. And then if they are eligible based on the form that we take them through, then we connect them with an official digital navigator that helps them walk them through the process. The one other just small piece I'll add is that one other thing that funders can do, and I think hopefully when I'm speaking, people are thinking, oh yeah, from a funder, these are things that we can be doing either as a foundation or supporting other people, other organizations to do as well. But we've also developed a digital matrix here in the Suncoast, which is really an asset map of who and what is working in digital access across the Suncoast region. And being able to see the landscape of who's working on it allows us to see where the gaps are and help fill in those, and then also see opportunities to strengthen. And in the case of digital navigators, identify organizations we may be able to support and in supporting other people in accessing the resources that are available.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for letting us know both about like the navigators, but as well as like the role of like engagers, like spreading the word, right? I think that's what the campaign for grade level reading opened up with, like, folks, let's spread the word, information you need to know, challenges and solutions. Okay, panelists, we're beginning to get some cute questions being popped. So take a look and scan. But before I turn over to Q&A, my kind of final question to each of you is, as you are some of the foremost thinkers about like digital connectivity, so, and what we're working on right now. So what topic do you think we should be talking about? What should we be talking about? And Michael, can I start with you? And I'll popcorn around. Michael, what should we be talking about? You can, let's do it this way. Give me the topic. Give me like, oh, I wish people would ask me about this. I wish people would talk about this. Give me the headline. We'll go around the table, and then we're going to go to some of our questions in the Q&A chat, and then I'm going to follow on some of those topics. Okay?
Okay. Well, I think, some of probably some of the myths concerning schools and digital connectivity,
Okay.
about what's sufficient or not, what's possible or not.
Okay. Myths surrounding like schools and connectivity. I'll loop back to you on that. Amina?
I think that it'd be great if people understood, the details around, when we can consider someone connected. So, like, I think it's like one thing that I noticed after the ECF passed and was out the door, people are like, okay, so can you do a new report about how many people are now unconnected? How many students are now unconnected? And I was like, the same students, right? Like, like they're largely in the digital divide because of poverty. And so until we alleviate poverty, like you're always going to have somebody who's going to fall on and off of all sorts of essential services, connectivity be one of them, right? And so, so there's cost, certainly, but I think cost is also very closely aligned with quality of service. And so one mistake that people make is like, if you're connected at all, you're connected. And that's just not true. And that's especially important in the context of education, because in the context of education, you've got an institution who's trying to roll out the use of certain tools, a tech, or, want to be able to sort of like make an assumption about how their students have access to what type of resources, the ease of accessing those resources, the reliability of accessing those resources, the experience that they have when they're engaging with those resources. These are all assumptions they make. And those assumptions start to fail if a student has very limited bandwidth or lacks adequate bandwidth to have the type of experience they're expecting. And so you might see outcomes with one student where you're like, why aren't they participating, or why aren't they uploading their stuff, or why don't they log on as frequently? And maybe that's because when they do, they get like a spinning wheel of death, or that like they're just not getting like the same experience somebody who is in a more well-resourced household with incredible bandwidth is getting. And so they're just not using the tool. What it means to the educator may be outcome based related to their grades, but really truly what the student is experiencing is a connectivity or a technical issue. And so I think having a better understanding of the definitions of what is connected, those tech specs, what quality of device, what quality of service, at what grade level, and with respect to what kind of curriculum, these are all details that matter. And us in the education community can flesh that out and provide an updated vision of what is required to the folks in the broadband policy community. And I think that's a really important thing that we can do.
Having the broadband community and the education community really kind of intersect at like a detailed and nuanced level, because then you understand the impact on the people in a more realistic way. Adeyinka, what do you wish we should be talking about more?
For me, I would say that what we found a lot in our work is that it really will take a village or a partnership of stakeholders to really close the digital divide. I think one of the things that came out of the pandemic is, folks looked to schools because everyone was so concerned about students and remote learning, or to libraries. But if we're really going to tackle connectivity and provide long-lasting, sustainable solutions, both in rural, urban, ex-urban communities, we are going to need that partnership between federal stakeholders. Yes, we have the federal resources right now, but then we're also going to need states to really weigh in and sustain that work. And then the local network of nonprofits and community stakeholders to really be invested in the training, the skills development, devices. Like, this is not just a one-time, we get the money, we spend it, and we're done. Like, if we're really going to solve connectivity and the digital skills and digital literacy learning that needs to happen, it needs to be that holistic village approach to addressing all of those spokes in the wheel.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think this is why Campaign for Grade Level Reading pulled us together, because we've got a lot of like village elders and village leaders here kind of on the call. Andrew, what do you think we should be talking more about with respect to digital connectivity?
Yeah, well, I first just want to emphasize Adeyinka's point about multi-sector and multi-organization collaboration. That has been one of the biggest themes that's come out of our National Philanthropy Scam, both phase 1, phase 2, and the workshops that we've run with funders from around the country. Is when you're thinking about doing this work in your community, be thinking about it from a multi-sector and multi-organization approach, because each sector and each organization has a unique value that they can bring to the work. And it's such a big and multifaceted issue that it requires all those different types of resources coming together. I think the one thing I'll add, and this is an area that we're kind of the next frontier for us, is we're struggling in the skills department. We feel like there's some movement around devices and broadband, but particularly in our region, we were really looking to identify organizations that are doing the skills work. And so I think that's something we need to talk about more, because as we've mentioned multiple times on this call, it's not enough to just have a device or just have broadband. And to Amina's point, there's also a quality of device and a quality of broadband. But then there's, how do you, when you have all that, how do you effectively engage with it? And engage with it to the point where it's not just accessing the opportunities, but like really thriving. When I think about the future of what workforce is going to look like when it comes to programming and AI and so on and so forth, it's not enough just to be able to access internet. It's another thing to be able to engage with it at a really high level.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, some of the questions in the chat are kind of about those skills that you're referencing, Andrew. Okay, turning over, and folks, please kind of feel free to continue to, just like put questions into the chat. Michael, I'm going to start with you because there's one about E-rate here. Andrew Emmerich is asking, is there an update on the E-rate program allowing funds to be used for cybersecurity in schools? I don't know if that's a level of detail too detailed, but
no, we don't have to go into detail. I mean, there is, but I mean, it's very early and incremental on that. Many of the school groups have been advocating, because that's a growing expense as, these cybersecurity has become, more and more threatening. And so what the chairwoman of the FCC is proposing a pilot program to fund, cybersecurity. And I think it's partly because, so it's just a pilot, and I believe they just finished receiving comments on that proposed rulemaking to allow that. So it's still, the exact shape of it is still an open question. So if you want to get engaged in that, you should go to the FCC's website and find that proposal and docket. And groups like Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition and others have filed comments urging this on a larger scale. But one reason I think that this is not being done in a larger way at this point is because there's a kind of an implication, which I agree with actually, that the connectivity program is the connectivity problem is more urgent. In other words, the homework app should be closed with the resources that are available before, perhaps ahead of something like cybersecurity, as potentially damaging as that is. And so E-rate really has limited funds. And so, I have a sense that the FCC is trying to get its connectivity priorities finished before moving on to cybersecurity, but they are doing this pilot in order to set that up for a future time.
mm-hmm. Thank you for taking that one on. And Adayinka and Andrew, I'm looking at the question from Surinda Sharma here. We've been talking at populations level, and I'm wondering if either of you have thought about this from the individual household level. So Surinder asks, what are some of the major challenges that you have seen at the individual household level for a successful implementation of broadband access or bridging the digital divide?
I'll start, Andrew, if you don't mind. Through a lot of our broadband adoption work and working with local stakeholders and community stakeholders, those that, like Amina mentioned, we have a population that's like subscription vulnerable. They may have an internet connection one month and may not have it another month. They understand the value proposition of the internet, but they recognize affordability is a challenge. I think one of the major challenges that doesn't get talked about enough is that the households that are internet skeptical, they've gone without the internet, or they may have a smartphone, but the idea of having a home broadband connection isn't something that they're fully bought into yet. So making sure that households understand the value proposition, what's in it for them, why does it make sense for them? Do they have a student in the household? Do they have to travel a great distance to see a healthcare provider? When you can explain that they can have an appointment in their home using telehealth because they have an internet connection, you really sort of bridge that gap for a household that has really been skittish of the internet up until this point. And then coupling that with programs like the ACP, that not only can you have this connection in your home, but you can have it at an affordable way. You can also get a device, but really getting down to that individual household need and making sure that you have the communication with them so that they understand why the internet is important to their household, and then how you can make it affordable for them. And that takes a lot of time and effort. Sometimes that's more than one conversation with the digital navigator, with a local stakeholder. You have to meet people where they are. I think it was Andrew that said that, but also get at what's in it for them.
Thank you. And Andrew, is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
No, that was great. That's it.
Okay. All right. There are some other questions here. I felt like that there was one about equipping parents with information just about digital literacy and kind of safety for their kids. And Hillary, I just kind of dropped into kind of the chat. Khan Academy has some free courses and on both number one, social media literacy and internet safety. So we can just put those links like straight into the chat as, oh, there you go. Thank you. Already did that. So resources available, developed for kids and their parents. All right. And, you know, and I do see other questions, kind of a little bit broader beyond the scope, but talking about student isolation and mental health, which are also important, but kind of beyond kind of like the immediate scope right now of connectivity. But certainly, Andrew, you've been talking about how connectivity intersects with other issues on wellness. Okay, just seeing if there's any kind of like last calls for questions. If not, we'll begin to kind of go. I think what at this point we'll kind of wrap up. I really just want to, oh, and there is the GLR engagement poll. So that link was just kind of dropped into the chat here. So you can do, oh, and then let me just double check if there is anything we would want to connect on. Oh, I know. I did promise us that we would get to some myth busting. I think people do have preconceived myths when it comes to what's blocking digital connectivity. What are some of those myths that you want to bust now? Who wants to hop in on this?
I'll get us started if you don't mind. I think one of the biggest myths is that connectivity only impacts rural households. We've had to do a lot of education with stakeholders, both at the state and federal level, that there are households in the suburbs who not only don't have access, but can't afford the access that's running down their street. And so I think that's one of the biggest myths, that we can't build our way out of the digital divide. We can't just build new networks. We have to tackle all of those folks, as I said, in communities across the country.
Thank you, Adeyinka.
Yeah, and even somewhat related to that, I'll mention one. This is perhaps a slightly narrower one, but it's important to understand. It relates to what Amina was saying earlier about, you know, you have to consider the quality of connectivity. There's a, you know, the Emergency Connectivity Fund, for example, was primarily aimed at funding devices and funding mobile hotspot connectivity. And at the time, I think Congress intended, and the commission explained that, well, this is an emergency. And so these things are readily available. You know, we can buy them sort of off the shelf. But the problem is, particularly in low income and less densely populated areas, the strength of the cellular networks are very weak. In other words, there's less investment in high capacity mobile broadband where there's less money to be made. So So in particular, low-income areas have poor mobile connectivity. The maps at the FCC will say that there's 100% coverage, because what that means is if you go outside, you can make a phone call. But if you're indoors, trying to see where students need to be at night, or especially when it's cold out, and you're trying to support remote learning, you often, very often, cannot do that on say a T-Mobile, one of these little T-Mobile hotspot eggs that they want to fund, even through this new program that I described. And so that's one part of the motivation for these school district programs. I mentioned Fresno, California. They did drive testing of their entire school district, and they found exactly what I described, that in the poorest areas, the cellular signals were the weakest and would not support streaming broadband. And so that's one reason they're investing in turning their schools into towers and using the free access to the airwaves to beam, actual high capacity broadband connectivity, because you need, as Amina said, you need quality of service to do remote learning indoors. So we can't just assume that any kind of broadband connectivity is sufficient. It has to really work, for what students need. And I'd say quickly too that that's related to the bigger question that both Adianka and Andrew brought up, that even a program like, as important as it is to extend the affordable connectivity program, even a $30 subsidy per month for a household, while that improves affordability a lot, it doesn't guarantee that students, get online with what they need. Because as I mentioned earlier, half of those households choose to put the subsidy toward a smartphone, which is the priority connectivity for the adults in the household, for one thing. And also so many households, find it difficult to apply or aren't interested. And so in those cases, if schools can really put the connectivity into the hands of students where needed, it's much better.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to go I have one more quick question here in the chat, and then we can kind of go to kind of call to actions that this community can take. So this is one from our very own Sarah Torian. Does anybody on the panel have a sense of whether or not extensions to the funding of ACP is being part of the federal funding framework that's currently being discussed?
Sorry, say that again. Extensions to.
Yeah, are there are extensions to the funding for ACP, is that being discussed as part of the federal funding framework at this point?
You mean the budget deal?
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, yeah. So I think that, the hope is that it would be included. So back in October, the president included, as part of the domestic supplemental request to Congress, ACP, so about $6 billion in funding for ACP. Following that, there has been a number of letters led by Senator Rosen, and letters by other members of Congress and other caucuses supporting the inclusion of funding for ACP. I think it's certainly under discussion. Folks in leadership are considering it. They understand the value of ACP. I think it's a difficult funding climate. And so, politically, I think it's very much up in the air whether or not a program like the ACP will be able to find $7 billion to be included, or $6 to $7 billion to be included for another year of funding, is what the estimate is. It's a hard lift in this political environment. So there is an opportunity right now, I think, for everybody to have their voices heard. I think that will make a difference, because there's always the ability for appropriators and for Congress to decide to fund it if they want to. There's nothing really preventing them, but it's a matter of a political decision. And I think having everyone's voices loud on ACP in this moment as they're making those decisions, I think will make a difference. If the sort of funding decisions pass, I don't think all hope is lost. There's still an opportunity to pass bills that will support ACP funding, whether it's in the short term or something long term tied to USF reform. So I think it's really valuable for folks to get their voices and their wishes heard by their member of Congress, by their congressional delegation. So to that extent, you can have organizations that you're a part of write a letter to Congress and your congressional delegation. That's going to make a big difference. And then just directly reaching out. So like telling your membership that they need to get loud about ACP right now so that the program doesn't wind down and run out of funding in April. That's super important. At Common Sense, we have set up a pretty easy tool, a call tool at savetheacp.org. And it allows you to call your member of Congress. It'll call you back to make sure you call both senators, or you can call back to make sure you call both senators. It's really important to do that like right now. These decisions are being done right now between now and the two-step funding decision. So at the end of this month, and then at the beginning of February, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to be heard, but I would say sooner the better. I would not wait on being heard.
Okay, I think that's the action we're ending on. Let's kind of like save this ACP Affordable Connectivity Program. I think you can just Google Common Sense Save ACP and you'll get to the link where you
SaveTheACP.org. Yeah, here
yeah,
save the
savetheacp.org. Contact your our representatives, our congressional representatives. I just wanted to say, Michael, Amina, Adeyinka, Andrew, thank you to the four of you for taking the time out, and most of all to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, to the staff and the community here for taking time out to kind of keep our communities, families, and students healthy. They need connectivity for education, for wellness, and for health. Thank you.
And I get to say one more thank you. So thank you, Irene, for investing your time, your energy, these conversations around what has worked, right? These bright spots of impact around hotspots on streetlights, around connecting every household and communities, around using schools as towers, apartment Wi-Fi, bus Wi-Fi, right? There's this wide variety of resources that tell success stories around digital connectivity. And we heard some of those today, but we also heard a call that says there is much more to be done. And so I would encourage each of you to not stop the work, the good work that you all do in your various places and spaces. And I mean you, our panel, of course, but I also mean each of you who attend these webinars to learn, to grow. And so thank you. And please continue to join us for our upcoming sessions. And so upcoming, we have a funder to funder conversation, catalytic leadership and philanthropy. That is next Tuesday at 2:30, or I'm sorry, at 12:30 Eastern time, 9:30 Pacific time. Our next big bets working is also next Tuesday, keeping the commitment to tutoring alive and strong. 3 p.m. Eastern time, 12 p.m. Pacific time. And then the following week, we will have engaging families for everyday attendance. Again, at that 3 p.m. and 12 p.m. Pacific time. And so we invite you to all join us for these upcoming webinars, and thank you for your time. Don't forget to fill out the survey before you log off. And so thank you all.